It was perfect, but no, you just had to blow it up. You and your pride and your ego. You just had to be the man. If you'd done your job, known your place, we'd all be fine right now.
Hello everyone, this is Pluto here. Welcome back to another video, and I'm sorry if I sound different in this video. I am sick right now. I'm a little sick, feeling under the weather a little bit lately, but I wanted to cover this this little topic. A lot of people have been making videos about this in the community. I've seen Liam make a video about this. I've seen Cheerval make a video about this. I've seen a lot of people make a video about this. Even Awesome the Sauce made somewhat of a video, kind of a video about it too. I wanted to talk about if Wizard101 is anti-casual, and I wanted to address some arguments with that, and let's just jump right in the video. So, in my opinion, Wizard101 has always been a game not intended for casuals. What do you mean by this? Well, Wizard101 is marketed as a children's game, but late game content in the game, even prior to things like raids, were not able to be completed by casuals. When we talk about Wizard101 casuals, we kind of have to change the definition of what a casual is. So to assess this argument, let's split the Wiz community into three separate groups. The first group are the real casual people. The casuals are the ones that occasionally play. They'll probably see Wizard101 got updated and they'll log on maybe once in a while, right? Maybe they were matched back in the day. Maybe they were playing a lot back in the day and they got to match, but they have since quit and they don't really play anymore. Usually a minority of them are match level. Usually they played Wizard101 back in the day and are returning for a little while. They have like a 2-week Wiz phase or whatever, and then they just stop playing again until a couple months later or whatever. Usually they're not matched. Usually they don't quest, and if they are matched by any chance, they definitely don't have the best gear and they don't play as much as other people play. Now, Wizard101 has never been intended for this group. Never been. Wizard101 is a long game. From getting to level 1 to 170, that's going to be a lot of time committed. You're going to need to commit a lot of time for that. So Wizard101 is not a casual game in that sense. What I think people are actually talking about is the second group of Wizard101 players. Now, these are the average players. These are players that continue to play to this day. These are players that are maxed. To be an average player in this game, I would consider you have to be maxed, or at the very least, you're very close to being maxed. Maybe you took like a little bit of a break from Wiz, or maybe you're still level 160, maybe you're still level 150. As long as you are actually trying to get to max, or you're playing playing about averagely, right, I would consider you an average player. Now, these are players, some may not have the best gear, but I would say the majority of them have the best gear, or at least trying to get the best gear, to get the best pet, right? I would consider these people average players. Now, the third group are hardcore players. These are the groups I think KingsIsle has been pivoting towards recently. The hardcore players are the players that will always have the best gear. They're always matched. They're always up to date on gear. And they enjoy the advanced content. They enjoy doing raids. They enjoy doing PvP. And usually they are deeply involved in the community as well. So with that being said, I believe Wizard101 to be inherently anti-casual. Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, we can debate about it. But what I'm going to address is I'm going to address it being anti-average. I'm going to address these people's arguments, like Cheerval's arguments and Liam's arguments, as it being anti-average player instead of anti-casual player, because it's always been anti-casual. Wizard101 has never been a game intended for casuals, and if you believe that, then I don't think that you are a casual player. I think that you are an average player. The middle group is the group that we're going to be debating about today, and I would say that the majority of players right now are in this middle group. Now, back in the day, you would probably have more players in the first group, but if you are continually playing Wizard101 today, if you play it a lot today, right, you're probably a member of the middle group. You're not usually a member of the third group. The third group is a very, very major minority. I think they're actually the least of the three groups is the third group. And it's kind of weird that KingsIsle has been pivoting towards this group because they are the least. So the middle group started to feel left behind when Wizard101 introduced the Voracious Void raid. Now, this raid essentially locked the best PvE robes behind it. I'll show you my robe right now. the Nullity Robe. I've made an entire in-depth video about why raids are a problem, so I'm going to try to not be too redundant here and try to repeat my arguments in that video. If you want to check out the video, link will be in the description. Anyways, as a result of the raids, some of these players were able to adapt. They found communities, and some of the more solo-oriented players didn't. The players that found communities and did raids that were in Group 2 became members of Group 3. So some players definitely changed over to Group 3. There was definitely probably a spike of players invested into hardcore content, hard content. I was one of the players that definitely pivoted towards advanced content. I was a member of Group 2, and I definitely pivoted towards doing advanced content after the raids came out. I was one of the first people to complete a raid with Awesome the Sauce. So the players in Group 2 that did not pivot to Group 3, which were a majority by the way, these players were pretty upset about how raids were introduced, and they felt like they had been left behind, essentially. So this all culminated into the release of the Nightmare Dungeon, which is this dungeon right over here. This dungeon essentially left every single member of Group 2 in the dust. Now let me explain how it did this. This dungeon is like a raid. It is extremely hard in the sense that it is a raid. Even in standard mode, it is really, really difficult. And I think KingsIsle basically kickstarted the alienation when they did the world's first event, where they only released this dungeon in challenge mode. I think this really upset a lot of members of Group 2 because they don't really have communities that can complete it. It essentially said that if you complete the dungeon first, if you're a member of the hardcore players, you get rewarded for it, which that's fair. I think that the world's first event was fair, but they promised a standard mode release and they promised it would be easier. I believe standard mode to actually maybe be a little bit harder. And it's not harder in the sense that completing the dungeon is harder. It's harder in the sense to get your gear from completing the dungeon. The standard mode drop rates are lowered, and the time it takes people to complete standard mode is abysmal. You can complete challenge mode really fast if you have a hardcore team. If you have a hardcore team of 4 players that all know what they're doing, you can complete challenge mode really fast. Doing standard mode with average players will take you probably at least an hour to complete. And that's why it's harder to get your gear. But average players can't just do challenge mode. They don't know how it works. They don't know how that game system works. They don't have that experience of being in raids. They don't have the experience because raids were gate kept from them by KingsIsle, which I go in depth on in my video, The Problem with Raids. Now, what is especially bad about the release of the Nightmare Dungeon is that prior to this, only the robes were the only piece of gear that were locked behind doing a raid. And now what you find here is that the Nightmare, which is essentially a raid, more or less, is now locking not only the robes, but the hat, boots, and wand behind it. The robe, prior to this update, there was always the alternative of the Aeon robe. There was always this alternative. If you didn't have it, you could always just go farm for the Aeon robe, go get the Aeon robe, grind for that. But now they're locking even the alternative best robe behind a raid-like dungeon. In my opinion, this is a major problem, and this problem is exacerbated by a few factors, with the dungeon in particular. Number 1, the crafting requirements. So as for every boss in the Wallaroo update, there is a crafting badge requirement. To craft the gear, you need to get a badge. So you need to defeat that boss in that dungeon a certain amount of times. And prior to this, it was usually only about 10 times. I think the largest one was the ships, which I believe was 15. I think it was 15 times, the final boss. And it was relatively easy to do that. It was not too hard, did not take you too long, and once you did, you could craft the gear. I think that was great. The problem with the Nightmare Dungeon is that the badge requirement requires you to defeat the Malice, which means completing the dungeon, 25 times. This is a problem. This will take an average player so long to do. Defeating the Malice 25 times would be the most painful and grindy thing I have ever done on Wiz. And I have farmed Dragoon gear on this game. Defeating the Malice 25 times is too much of a time commitment for players to put into the game. How standard mode is right now, a lot of players will get frustrated by the maze, by the difficulty of it, and they'll just quit. They'll just stop. So you're going to put in the time and effort for a lot of runs that are just going nowhere anyways. And not to mention the fact that an average player will probably complete a standard mode run in 1 to 2 hours, which means on the high side, you'll be farming for 2 days straight. On the low end, you'll be farming for an entire day. You'll be doing this for an entire 24-hour period, which average players don't have the time commitment for like hardcore players do. Another problem is that the drop rates in this dungeon are super low. I did this dungeon for the first time on my storm on stream. I streamed it for about 2.5 hours, and I got a balanced Dream Reaver hat. I have no use for it. I don't have a max balance. I have 4 maxes. Not one piece of gear that I get was one of those stools. I got a balance hat. I got an off-stool piece of gear for completing this dungeon. While this isn't necessarily a problem, it is a problem when you combine the fact that only the final boss in the dungeon drops any gear. And it's combined with the fact that you can get Warper gear, which is just the worst version of the Reaver gear. So the drop rates being super low definitely hurt the dungeon, because now you basically have to get the badge. And not only that, the dungeon is too challenging, as I mentioned earlier, particularly the maze. It makes it less enjoyable for many players that are trying to complete it. And I think the biggest reason in particular is that the gear is only a slight improvement. Yes, it's something that hardcore players will want. Hardcore players will want the gear. They will want to have the best stats. But for the average player, when you look at the gear, what does it do for you? It increases maybe your health a little bit, and it increases your pierce a little bit. But because of the new damage cap or damage limit, it does not do much for you at all. It has definitely put me off from farming the gear. I do think that these are problems that KingsIsle can easily fix. In just one small patch to the game, they can easily fix these things. You can make standard mode easier. I can make an entire video about how to make standard mode easier on the Nightmare Dungeon. Maybe I will go into depth on that in another video, we'll see. But I think that making it easier, decreasing the requirements for the badge, it's another thing. Making it so you only have to do the dungeon maybe 10 times is fine. 25 times is too much, way too much. And then just making the drop rates better. Adding drops to the other 2 bosses in the dungeon would be great. And also making it so maybe you get a guaranteed piece of gear for your stool on the final boss. That would be fine as well. I think that this highlights a problem that Wizard101 needs to face moving forward. And it's that prior to this update, Wizard101 had been at least somewhat accessible to Group 2, to the average player. And nowadays, with this new update, with the new Nightmare Dungeon, it is just not. And that's a problem. Even when raids were a thing, it was only one piece of gear that was locked behind them. Advanced content only had one piece of gear locked behind it, and there were alternative setups. Now, you need to do what is essentially advanced content to get your gear, and that is a major issue. KingsIsle recently has been pivoting towards Group 3, the hardcore players, and I don't really understand why. These players are a minority. Content creators are a minority. I should not be the one KingsIsle is pivoting towards. Awesome the Sauce is not someone that KingsIsle should be pivoting towards. Liam is a Vibe is not someone KingsIsle should be pivoting towards. And I think all of these content creators would agree with me. KingsIsle, you should be pivoting towards Group 2, the average player. These players are in the majority. These are the players that will play your content no matter what. They do genuinely care about the game, and they do play a lot. I understand that they don't play as much as Group 3 does, but they still play your content, and you are alienating them. With these new raids, you are alienating them. With this new advanced content in the Nightmare Dungeon, you are alienating them. You're leaving them behind. You've already seen major content creators, for example, Blaze Lifehammer, quit the game. I'm not here to speculate that he quit the game because of the advanced content, but when you look at his tweets and when you look at how he was acting leading up to that, prior to raids being a thing, you can definitely see that he was not happy with how they were released. He was not happy with it. This problem needs to be addressed before they release the new raid. Before. Here's what KingsIsle needs to do in the spring update for 2024. They need to make guilds and raids accessible to Group 2. I don't want to go too into depth on how to fix raids, as I have done it in a previous video, but I did have a new idea I wanted to say in this video, and that idea is making a standard mode version of raids. I think this would fix a lot of the problem, and it would make it so that you don't alienate the Group 2 players. And this standard mode should be easier. It should not be harder than the actual raid, where like the standard mode is for the Nightmare right now. It should be easier. And I think this would definitely help them moving forward. And obviously, in the spring update this year, they need to address a few problems. They need to make the Nightmare Dungeon easier. They need to address the stat limit, which I have a major problem with. I don't think that this should be a thing. There's a lot of problems that King's Down needs to address, and I think I'll make a video on things that the spring update needs to do in Wizard101 later in the year. But for now, that's going to be the end of this video. I want to thank you all very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. I set a goal to get to 500 subscribers before the summer in some of my previous videos. I now see that I need to amend that goal because I think we're going to reach 500 much sooner. So let's try to reach 500 by the end of February. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching my videos. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.